late summer day. You all got that little recording notice just now. AJ's hit record so we can get this recorded for everybody. Tonight, hailing in from Seattle, Washington, AJ Musewe, going to give our talk about Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and it's going to bring together or wrap up these pieces that we've been talking about this period of time that continues to be incredibly important for us as a country today. So I appreciate everybody who's joined these talks. You'll get all 3 lectures in one email, all the recordings by tomorrow morning, along with some action steps for you all. I know AJ is as always a little nervous before this talk, but she's ready. She's I'm certain gonna nail this. So appreciative, AJ, for what you've given to us so far and for our friendship and colleagueship. So AJ Musewe, let's everybody clap for AJ. Yay, AJ, yeah.
I appreciate it, and also he's 100% correct. I am freaking out, but you know what? We're gonna figure it out together as a unit. Okay, folks, let's get into it. All right. Whew. Christ on a cracker. Okay, let's do this. Welcome to the last lecture in the Truths to Power Moments That Shifted the Civil Rights Movement series. This is 8 minutes of pure brilliance. Okay, again, this is how we're going to move through this. We're going to do a little timeline refresher to help orient us. The who and what we should know include Freedom Summer, the Freedom Vote, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and of course, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. We're also then going to take a look at her testimony in front of the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. And for that one, we're going to focus on the importance of vernacular. Then we're going to close out with the legacy of Mrs. Hamer, and then we're going to do questions. Okay. As always, I will use color photographs whenever I am able to. For this one, I will be using more black and white photographs, but this is what I wanted us to start off with, okay? Before we get into the timelines. This is the lead up to Freedom Summer, right? On Monday, we talked about the March on Washington and how passionate the SNCC folks were, and the fervor and anger that John Lewis gave with the original speech, and even also some of the edited speech. This is the reason why, right? This is May 28th, 1963, Woolworth's counter in Jackson, Mississippi. This is what SNCC workers are trained to endure. In the photograph to your left, you see a gentleman. Calling him a gentleman feels so horrible considering what he's doing to these people. You see a guy with a cigarette. SNCC workers were also burned with cigarettes. The image to your right is of Benny Oliver, who is a police officer in Jackson, Mississippi, and he is kicking Memphis Norman, who is a Black SNCC volunteer and activist who had just been pulled off of one of the benches. This, unfortunately, is the legacy of whiteness. Okay, I want you to pay attention to how many people are also watching. When you do nothing and you just watch the thing happen, you are also complacent in that act of violence. And so this is what, this is an idea of the temperature of what civil rights workers are trying to survive. Okay, high level timeline. So Monday, we got to the March on Washington. And then today we're going to look at what caused the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We're going to, on a high level, look at the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Neshoba County, because that's important to the overall story of Freedom Summer. In July, Freedom Summer kicks into high gear, but we are going to focus on how the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party got to the National Convention in Atlantic City and the testimony that Mrs. Hamer gave, which then all of these things together led to the passing of both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965, respectively. Okay, we're going to take a look again at the major players. This is an image of, oopsies. This is an image of SNCC workers at Tougaloo College in 1965 during a conference and also nonviolence training. I mean, these guys are so young. Okay, so the main organizations that we're going to be focusing on are SNCC. Remember, SNCC was first conceived by Mrs. Ella Baker at Shaw University at the thanks to the notoriety of the direct action sit-ins. And really, we're going to be focusing on COFO, which was concentrating the efforts of SNCC, the NAACP, and CORE. CORE was the Congress for Racial Equality. And they are the ones who really launched the Freedom Summer Project in Mississippi in 1964. And remember, all of this was working towards the civil rights and democratic freedom for Black folks. So just to give us an idea of what the environment is at the time, I'm just gonna really quick check the chat. Oh, hi folks. Okay. 1964. This is the temperature in 1964 specifically. All right. It's segregated everything, really. Black people were considered so dirty that you couldn't use the same facilities. The white man that you are looking at pouring acid into the pool is James Brock from a hotel in St. Augustine, Florida. Remember, David talked about St. Augustine as being this transformative space for President Lyndon B. Johnson. St. Augustine was also a space for violence. The Black woman that you see looking directly at the camera is Mimi Jones, who had marched for Dr. King previously. And activists are staging a swim-in to desegregate pools, right? And at times it was pouring acid into pools like James Brock is doing here. Other times it was draining the pools. I think there's a famous story of it's either Eartha Kitt or Dorothy Dandridge, one of the two. I will look that up unless somebody knows and can put it in the chat, of her dipping a toe in the pool and them draining the pool, right? Again, this is the legacy of whiteness. This is why when I was 7 years old, I was told that I was too dirty to swim at a church swimming pool. That was my first introduction into racism, and that was not in the 1960s. So this is what folks are working against as they try to gain access to vote. So with that, let's look at freedom schools. This photograph doesn't state where the Freedom School was, but I'm assuming it was either in Mississippi or Alabama, but most likely it was in Mississippi. It doesn't state exactly what city it was in, but this is an idea of what some of the students that participated in the Freedom Schools looked like. In order for us to understand the importance of 1964, we have to talk about Freedom Summer. This is a clip of a segment that was done interviewing the filmmaker of the documentary Freedom Summer. Here we're going to get a really good overview of what Freedom Summer was, what the intention of the trainings for students during Freedom Summer was, especially the volunteer activists, and also kind of what was their opposition and what was the violence that they faced as they kind of embarked on this grand adventure.
And Martha Reddit spoke with the filmmaker Stanley Nelson.
It was 1964. African Americans had been given the right to vote almost 100 years earlier, yet fewer than 7% had registered, and it was no wonder.
You'd be fired from your job if you even tried to go down and register to vote. If you had a loan, any kind of loan, they would cut your loan. They would publish your name in the paper. Then there was something called the registrar who would then make you take a test. And inevitably, if you're African American, you fail.
You didn't write anything in there. You didn't pass it.
Stanley Nelson's new film is a deep and at times unsettling look at the brave women and men who fought for voting rights just 50 years ago.
You have your certificate showing that you are a registered voter.
Civil rights organizers in Mississippi had been fighting an uphill battle to register African Americans.
We must be stronger than the enemy.
They needed help from outside the state and looked north.
They invited 700 volunteers, mainly white college students.
Students who had no idea what they would be getting into.
One of the things that surprised me is there was tension.
Part of the frustration with the organizers was trying to say, this is what it's going to be like down there. They could see that the kids didn't really understand it.
You're going to wind up in jail. I suggest we be a little more serious about this thing.
But that would quickly and tragically change.
They went missing on the first day of Freedom Summer, the very first day.
On June 21st, 1964, three young activists, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner from New York and James Chaney from Mississippi, vanished.
The people who understood Mississippi knew that they were never going to.
Okay, so real quick, before I get to Cheney, Goodman, and Schorner, I just want to kind of round out the conversation around Freedom Summer book. Real quick, let me check the chat. Okay, we're good. So essentially, Freedom Summer was 10 weeks, right, of freedom schools. In order for folks to be able to register to vote, they needed to be literate to pass the literacy test. And so a lot of it was folks learning how to read and write to be able to pass these tests, studying the Constitution and the other ridiculous questions that Black citizens would be asked in order for them to be able to vote. Also, some folks just didn't have the opportunity to go to school because they either didn't have funds or just didn't have access to good school. So a lot of folks just went to also learn how to read and write. In addition to all of the volunteers, you also had a number of other organizations supporting, giving support to COFO, including more than 100 volunteers, doctors, nurses, psychologists, medical students, and other medical professionals from the Medical Committee for Human Rights. They provided emergency care for volunteers and local activists. They also helped teach the health education classes and advocated for improvements in Mississippi's segregated health system. Remember yesterday, if you were able to catch David's lecture or watch the recording, he talked about Medgar Evers being shot in front of his home and then being taken to a hospital, and he not received treatment because he was Black. Imagine if Medgar Evers had actually received the treatment that he needed right when he got to the hospital. Right. In addition to medical professionals, there were also volunteer lawyers from organizations such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the National Lawyers Guild, Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, which was an arm of the ACLU, and also the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. And these guys provided free legal services. They also handled arrests, freedom of speech violations, voter registration, and other matters. While the Freedom Summer volunteers were trying to register voters. Now, it is important that we do talk about Cheney, Goodman, and Schorner because this was the violence that these folks faced. So imagine you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. You just came from the North to come and do a bunch of work. You're filled with this righteous indignation that John Lewis was talking about. And right before everybody goes out to go start doing all the work that they had been trained for, you hear that 3 volunteers have not been heard from. I'm going to get into that photograph in a second, but I want us to get an idea of the severity of these students finding out that Cheney, Goodman, and Schorner had gone missing. And think about yourself in this position. Like, what is the mindset that you think that you would have? And also, would you continue forward if you find out about the violence that was happening towards volunteers?
Everybody was to come into the auditorium for this session. They had this extremely solemn look on their faces. And then they told us that 3 workers who had been at the orientation and had left early, they had disappeared.
I urge people to contact their families and have their families contact their congressional people to indicate that we believe that there certainly was a possibility, given the fact that so many hours had gone by and that they couldn't be located, that they might have been killed.
The 3 civil rights workers who disappeared in Mississippi last Sunday night still have not been heard from. A search has thus far produced only one clue, the burned-out station wagon in which the 3 were last seen riding. Andrew Goodman, a 20-year-old college student from New York. James...
Learning that 3 of our members, 2 of whom were white, had disappeared, really blew away all my ideas that possibly we would have protection from the fact that the majority of the summer volunteers were white. I knew now that that was not the case, that everybody was in grave danger, and that these Mississippians would kill all of us, white and Black.
Okay, so at the beginning of Freedom Summer, this is what's happening. This is just the state of things in Mississippi. The gentleman in the photograph that you're looking at, I took that photograph in early 2020, I believe, February, I think. That's Mr. Leroy Clemens of Neshoba County. I think at the time he was the deputy mayor. Mr. Clemens is part of the reason why we know what happened to Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. He is a major part of the reconciliation that's happening between the Black community and the white community in Neshoba County right now. That spot that Mr. Clemens is standing on is the spot where Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered. Edgar A. Killen, who died in 2018, basically orchestrated the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner along with Klan members. And Mr. Clemens basically made it his mission to get deathbed confessions from the folks who participated in the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. If folks would like to know more, I can talk about that afterwards, but I will say this: the brutality of whiteness in the face of upward mobility within the Black community is gruesome. That tree that is directly behind Mr. Clemens was identified by multiple people as the tree that James Chaney was chained to, and all of his bones were broken. And that violence is specific to James Chaney. Again, out of respect for Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, and also the violence and some of the Black folks in the space, I'm not going to go into further detail on their murders, but we can have that conversation during the Q&A section so folks are able to excuse themselves if they choose to. So imagine this is the environment, right? You're a young volunteer. Bob Moses is sitting here trying to, this is Bob Moses. Bob Moses passed in July. I was lucky enough, or I guess I should say, I was lucky enough that David allowed me to come to a meeting with Bob Moses in 2017. So I was lucky enough to be able to meet him. One of the quietest and most powerful people I've ever been in a room with. But anyway, so now you understand what the severity is for Freedom Summer. This is Bob Moses at an orientation at Western College for Women, which is now part of Miami's Western campus. And he's doing a Freedom Summer orientation. So now we need to switch gears, right? We need to get into the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. In order for us to do that, we need to understand what the voter intimidation kind of looks like around the South. If you've been part of some of the lectures that Dr. Scott and I have given, these numbers should look a little familiar to you. So if we look at the state of Louisiana, right? 1870, the 15th Amendment passes and Black men have the right to vote, and boy, do they register to vote. At its height, there were 850,000 Black men who were registered to vote, and also during the Reconstruction era, which was from between 1865 to 1877-ish, you had over 2,000 Black men hold positions in office, all the way from state and state reps and senators, all the way down to like ombudsmen and local office. By 1896, which also was the same year of the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case, you had 130,000 Black men registered in the state of Louisiana. 4 years later, that number drops down to 5,000. And then another 4 years after that, that number drops down to 1,000, right? And it is pure violence and intimidation. So this image in the clip that we saw that was explaining Freedom Summer, they talked about the registrar's office. This image is actually from the registrar's office that's in that clip. And that notice behind says, applications for registration must be completely filled out without any assistance or suggestion of any person or memorandum. After 10 days, applicants' names and addresses are published for 2 consecutive weeks in the newspaper. They cannot be ruled on until 14 days after the second publication. Therefore, it can take as long as X amount of days before we can give you an answer as to your application being accepted or rejected. And 93 to 96% of the time, your application was rejected. And so this is what voter intimidation by the state looks like, because again, it's at the registrar's discretion, right? So in 1963, there was a November gubernatorial election, and the residents of Mississippi would try to cast their vote, but obviously were violently denied. There was also this narrative going around that Black people didn't want to vote anyway. And that narrative also left out the voter intimidation through violence, poll taxes, literacy tests, and just general harassment. And so an idea came up to hold a freedom vote, which was going to be scheduled parallel to the 63 election. And so this pamphlet was handed out, right? Instead of you voting for one of the Democrats, and this is a map of what Mississippi looked like in 1963, right? Mississippi was a blue state, which is like not what Mississippi is right now. Okay. And so rather than voting for whatever Democrat, you were supposed to put in a freedom candidate, which was going to be Aaron Henry, who at the time was called the most recognized Black man in Mississippi. He was with the NAACP. And then this is Reverend Ed King, who was the chaplain out at Tougaloo College. And so he was going to be lieutenant governor. And the point of the freedom vote was a protest vote. And so it was freedoms for votes, justice, jobs, and education. And it breaks down what that means. One of the important ones that I want to call out, which is going to tie into the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, is the freedom to learn and attend good schools, to be able to finish school without fear of having to drop out to go to work. That means one good school system and not two inferior ones. Okay. Also, freedom to have a just trial without fear of brutality or intimidation by the police. That's also really important. And then the bottom part of the flyer basically just gives people instructions on what to do. So between November 2nd and November 4th, Black folks cast their votes in high numbers, right? And then essentially what the Council of Federated Organizations did is they embarked on a 3-week campaign, including rallies, organizing poll sites, and generally just spreading out word and to get people prepared for this election between the 2nd and the 3rd. And there was a gentleman who was a participant who remembered, he said, though this was obviously not a quote unquote legal ballot, everybody realized that it was a test of whether we can really get people to put their bodies on the line for the right to vote, because they would have to show up in a public space and check a ballot. And they did. 83,000 Mississippians participated in the freedom vote. So all of this basically led up to the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was the brainchild of these three folks, right? This is Mr. Bob Moses and Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer at the Democratic National Convention over here. And then to your right is Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Ella Baker. And so they decided they were going to create a Democratic Party that was going to accurately represent the people of Mississippi, because the people of Mississippi, if they had access to fair elections, would actually participate in the democratic process. And so that was the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Let me just check chat real quick. Nice job on the chat, Prof. Okay, so what was their plan of attack? Essentially, what they did is through caucuses and county assemblies. This is an image from the convention. They held a convention to replace the one-party system in Mississippi as a rightful representation of the people. And so on August 6, 1964, 68 delegates were chosen to represent Mississippi at the Democratic National Convention. And so they made their plan known. So the Democratic Party of Mississippi referred the challenge to the Credentials Committee, which is how we got the speech that we are about to get into. I just want to make a note. This convention was 2 days after they found the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Okay, so at all times, the reminder of violence in you trying to exercise your right as a first-class citizen was always present. Now we get into the convention. I mean, that's just massive. I think because of COVID, I just can't imagine being in a crowd like that. Okay, let's get into the convention. Before we talk about the convention, we obviously need to talk about Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. This is one of the few colorized photos I've been able to find of her at the actual convention, because everything else is in black and white. So she was born in Montgomery County, Mississippi, and stopped going to school at the age of 12 to help her family with their sharecropping work. If you're not familiar with what sharecropping is, I highly recommend you Google it, but essentially it's just tenant farming, and it is a horrible, horrible way to keep Black people in debt. And it's just another version of continuing enslavement. After she became an adult and she got married, she ended up working on the plantation of B.D. Marlowe with her husband and her children. Also, Mrs. Hamer was the last born of 20 children, which is like bananas in pajamas, right? One thing that's specific to Mrs. Hamer is she moved in the intersection of womanhood and Blackness. We'll get into this specifically, but think of Jane Crow, which is something that we talked about at a quick high level during the first presentation. Also, specifically to Mrs. Hamer and other Black women, she was sterilized without her consent or knowledge in 1961, so she could not have children. She was recruited by SNCC at a church service where she heard James Bevel preaching, and James Bevel basically just told people that they had the right to vote, which she didn't know because she wasn't taught that, right? Also, the access to information is also used as a weapon. So obviously, if you don't want a bunch of Black folks to learn that they have the right to vote, then you keep certain things out of the public education system so that they don't learn it. Critical race theory is a thing. It was a thing back then too. Okay, well, not in its current inception. And so over the course of the next 15 years, she gave speeches all over, including also at the 1968 and 1972 Democratic National Convention. She spoke at the founding of the National Women's Political Caucus. She also spoke at Harvard, Duke, and even came up to Seattle U. I'm trying to find the speech that she gave at Seattle U if possible. But the one thing that Mrs. Hamer was known for above all else was her singing. So I just want to take a moment to listen to Mrs. Hamer sing. There's going to be a voice that's going to talk about what songs meant to the movement, what Mrs. Hamer particularly, when she sang, meant to the movement. And I'm almost positive that that voice is of Dr. Bernard Lafayette.
I'm trying to make home. I have no hope for tomorrow. I'm trying to make heaven my home.
When Mrs. Hamer sang songs of salvation, songs of redemption, songs of struggle, and it calmed the people, you know, as they sat there in the bus, being intimidated because they wanted to be citizens of this great country.
I started to make it my home.
In some cases, what you wanted to do was not just to sing a song that was soothing. You wanted to sing a song where there was participation by people. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord. Have you got good religion? Certainly, Lord.
So songs were important, right? Yesterday, we heard David talk about the young students that are coming out of Brown Church. Before they started the Birmingham Children's Crusade in 1963, they came out singing, right? Mrs. Hamer was known to start singing when moments were tense, especially right before they had an interaction with the police. She was definitely most famously known for singing "This Little Light of Mine," and it would calm people before they had to go and engage with the police. Because again, nonviolence was imperative to the movement. Okay, part one. The thing that I want us to pay attention to is the difference in language that Mrs. Hamer has compared to the way that we saw John Lewis give his speech, right? John Lewis used metaphors, right? He calls back to history when he's talking about 100 years ago, you know, this country learned that segregation and racism was bad. He's, you know, calling back to the Emancipation Proclamation. He talks about the scorched earth policy of Sherman. There are all these kind of little things that possibly you would know had you been able to continue your education. Mrs. Hamer, on the other hand, is talking to the everyday sharecropper, the person who didn't get access to education because they're locked in a life of debt, right? The person who the Bible is probably the most important book to them. And so she uses biblical terms like raising Cain, which ties to the story of Cain and Abel. I went to Jesuit college. So like, if you need to talk the Bible, we can do that offline. She uses language and vernacular that is similar to, or would be kind of the start of what is considered AAVE, African American Vernacular English. This is going to be a really important lesson in code switching. She understood that she had to talk to two separate audiences. So her language had to be accessible enough for the poor sharecropper, but still proper enough, and I'm putting that in quotations for a certain reason, proper enough for the white folks in the credentials committee to understand what she was trying to say. So everything that she says in this speech is very matter of fact. There's no bobbing and weaving around it. She says what she needs to say, and then she gets up and she leaves. So pay attention to the difference in the way that she delivers her speech as far as her words and the like brilliant simplicity of her just giving testimony. Okay. Okay. So the gentleman who's going to be, check the chat real quick. Okay. So the gentleman who's going to be introducing Mrs. Hamer is John Rao, and he is a famed civil rights attorney who works for on behalf of the movement. And he gives a really kind of brilliant overview of why he wants Mrs. Hamer to give her testimony and what he wants the Credentials Committee to understand and to hear. So this is him introducing Mrs. Hamer and her kind of giving the first part of this testimony.
It is the very terror that these people are living through that is the reason that Negroes aren't voting, that they're kept out of the Democratic Party by the terror of the regular party. And what I want the Credentials Committee to hear is the terror which the regular party uses on the people of Mississippi, which is what Reverend King was explaining, which is what Aaron Henry was explaining, and which is what the next witness will explain, Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, my name is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and I live at 626 East Lafayette Street, Rooseville, Mississippi. Sunflower County, the home of Senator James O. Eastland and Senator Stennis.
Okay, so she starts off by giving her name and her address. At this point, remember, if you have registered to vote, they put your business out there anyway. So she was like, look, I'm gonna just save y'all the trouble. This is my name. This is where I live. Then she does something that's pretty brilliant, right? In the same way that John Lewis called out that the party of Kennedy is also the party of Eastland, that the party of Jarvis is also the party of Goldwater, she does it kind of in her own way, right? She says, you know, Sunflower County, which is the home of Senator James O. Eastland and John Stennis. Who is John Stennis? John Stennis was a raving racist. Okay, he equated the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and SNCC to communists. He also signed what was called the Southern Manifesto, or more formally known as the Declaration of Constitutional Principles in 1965. And essentially what that wanted to do was prevent the integration of public spaces. James O. Eastland and Stennis in the same state should not have been allowed. So towards the end of this clip, Lyndon B. Johnson announces that he wants to have a press conference. There in the Freedom Summer documentary, Bob Moses is interviewed, and Bob Moses talks about this moment, right? And he says that it wasn't Dr. King or even Malcolm X that Lyndon B. Johnson feared. It was Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, because the day before, some folks had already heard a version of this testimony, including the story that kind of is at the crescendo of this testimony. And Lyndon B. Johnson did not want that heard, okay? Also, Lyndon B. Johnson was wheeling and dealing behind the scenes because he needed to get enough votes to get reelected, because the reason he got the presidency is because of the assassination of JFK. So he had his own kind of master plan, and he did not want people to hear Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. And so because at this time he could not have multiple live feeds, all of the live cameras went to Lyndon B. Johnson, and there he goes in a press conference, and he's like, I would like to commemorate the 9-month anniversary of the assassination of JFK. Everybody's looking at him kind of weird, but in his mind, he was like, okay, now you guys don't get to watch Mrs. Hamer's testimony, but joke's on him. They recorded it and it played on the evening news, and this is kind of the testimony that launched Mrs. Hamer into the national spotlight. But I have not been able to find another full audio video of Mrs. Hamer giving her testimony. So we're going to be listening to audio. And this is a book that I highly recommend, folks. I have it literally like right here. If you want to read some of the other speeches of Mrs. Hamer, again, I will send out a resource list just to everybody on the email listserv, so folks can kind of dig into it as they choose to. But this image is a colorized image of sharecroppers in Georgia, I believe, in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. These are the folks that Mrs. Hamer is talking to. These are the folks that Mrs. Hamer comes from, right? You can see in the image that some of the folks in this do not have shoes. Mrs. Hamer, in biographies talking about her life, talked about how sometimes it was so cold that they just had to wrap rags around their feet because they could not afford shoes, right? And so we are going to hear her talk about an experience. She starts off right after she had tried to go register to vote for the first time. And in this piece, she's going to give us an example of the immediate consequence of registering to vote, not just to her, but to people who are attached to her.
After we paid the fine among us, we continued on to Roosevelt, and Reverend Jess Sonny carried me 4 miles in the rural area where I had worked as a timekeeper and sharecropper for 18 years. I was met there by my children that told me the plantation owner was angry because I had gone down, tried to register. After they told me, my husband came and said the plantation owner was raising Cain because I had tried to register. And before he quit talking, the plantation owner came and said, Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I mean that, said if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. Said then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we are not ready for that in Mississippi. And I addressed him and told him that I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself. I had to leave that same night. On the 10th of September, 1962, 16 bullets was fired into the home of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Tucker for me. That same night, 2 girls were shot in Roosevelt, Mississippi. Also, Mr. Joe McDonald's house was shot in.
Okay, so if you hear the way she tells the testimony, right, compared to John Lewis reading a speech, this is just Mrs. Hamer giving an account of an incident that happened in her life as she tried to register to vote. She talks about how 16 bullets were fired into the house of people that she knew for her, because when she initially had to leave her place, she went to go stay with him, and then she ended up going somewhere else. And so people assumed that she was still with that original family, and then fired shots into their home. So it wasn't just that Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer goes and registers to vote, she loses her job in her home and has to go find somewhere else to live. It's people that were attached to her. Also, this ripple effect of you trying to register to vote also affects the people around you. This careless violence that happens in the face of Black upward mobility from white people who are afraid, right? If we think back to J.W. Milam in his interview with Look magazine, right? When he's talking about why he had to kill Emmett Till, right? He says he doesn't want Black people to get access to vote because if they did, they'd control the government. There's this idea that Black people are going to retaliate against white folks for the treatment that they've experienced. But I will just let you know that the Black people in my life are not thinking about trying to retaliate against white people. We are too busy trying to figure out how to get our kids into better schools, to get less policing in our communities, and to get access to healthy foods. Nobody's worried about what white folks are doing, okay? So now we move to the next part. This is Mrs. Hamer singing. I also imagine that holding the megaphone up to your ear as she's singing is probably not the best thing for his hearing. Okay, so now we begin the kind of walk into the probably more violent aspect of her testimony. I couldn't find an image of the county jail in Winona, Mississippi, but this is an image of the county courthouse. I just want to say for the next 2 pieces of her testimony, I will advise a trigger warning. Mrs. Hamer does not mince her words. She very much so and very matter-of-factly talks about the violence that both she hears and witnesses, and also what is done to her. In this piece, she talks about she just finished right before we get to this clip. She had just talked about them going to register to vote, and they're on their way back. They stop at a bus terminal in order to use the restroom and get food at the restaurant. Remember, bus terminals are supposed to be desegregated. And because of the commotion and having all these Black folks kind of milling about, the police are called. And so she starts this clip right after she is kicked by the police officer and placed into the car to be taken to the county jail. Again, if acts of violence are difficult for you to process and to hear, I would recommend you turning down your volume until we get into the next portion of this. And I can give folks a warning again.
He kicked me. I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells. I was placed in a cell with a young woman called Miss Vesta Simpson. After I was placed in the cell, I began to hear sounds of licks and screams. I could hear the sounds of licks and horrible screams. And I could hear somebody say, "Can you say yes, sir, nigger? Can you say yes, sir?" And they would say other horrible names. She would say, "Yes, I can say yes, sir." So, "Well, say it." She said, "I don't know you well enough." They beat her I don't know how long. And after a while, she began to pray and ask God to have mercy on those people.
So I've mentioned that the church is really important to the movement, right? At the end of this this clip, she talks about how the woman starts to pray for folks, right? Again, if there was retaliation at the forefront of the minds of many Black folks, the nonviolent movement would not have been possible. So I would urge folks to try and think about where these supposed thoughts around the violence that Black people are going to enact on white folks come from. And we can talk about that in terms of, so during Freedom Summer and the disappearance, when they found out that Black folks, volunteers were coming into Mississippi, Mr. Leroy Clemens heard a story from one of the white Klan members that said that when they learned that folks were coming up to look at locations in Marion for the Freedom Summer school, that the white KKK members, the Klan members, would go around telling folks that Freedom Summer was sending a bunch of Black men to come and assault white women. So these rumors of violence are actually started by the very people who then go and enact that same violence to Black people. So we get into now this section, which is our second to last section in the lecture today. Again, this is going to be Mrs. Hamer now turning the narrative to herself. Okay. Again, I would just trigger warning. She explains what happens to her in a very matter-of-fact way. It is violent what happens to her. This clip is about 1.5 minutes long. I want you to pay attention to this image, this photograph of Mrs. Hamer, which was taken during the testimony. This is probably one of the clearest images I've seen of her from a different angle. Mrs. Hamer is, in all of the videos that I have been able to find of her testimony, Mrs. Hamer never once looks down. She keeps her head up high, her eyes are clear, and she does, you can see her kind of wring her hands. And I can only imagine her giving this testimony in front of thousands of people there in the convention. And then also, you know, however many people are going to watch this, but she stood steadfast. And again, I'm going to press play. I'm going to just like wave my hand right before I press play. If you feel like you need to reduce the volume so that you do not hear this, please do so if that is what's best for your mental health. But I also urge people to listen to Mrs. Hamer give testimony of what happened to her in the jail in Winona.
And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was a state highway patrolman. And he asked me where I was from. And I told him Roosevelt. He said, "We're going to check this." And they left my cell, and it wasn't too long before they came back. He said, "You are from Roosevelt, all right," and he used a curse word. And he said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead." I was carried out of that cell into another cell where they had 2 Negro prisoners. The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on my left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack. The second Negro began to beat, and I began to work my feet. And the state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro had beat to sit on my feet. to keep me from working my feet. I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up.
Okay. Part of the reason I titled this slide "Dignity as a Weapon" is because that's exactly what happens, right? It's bad enough that Black men were used to beat her, to kind of do the dirty work, which is a tactic that has been used since the days of enslavement, right? It's twice as humiliating and degrading to have a person who is held in a state of bondage, who does not have control, to be the one used as the tool against you. She specifically talks about the dress. Again, this is an example of the specific type of terror that Black women face. Because at that point, when the white police officer then goes and lifts her dress back up, she doesn't know what that means. She doesn't know what that could be preparing her for, right? Again, on Monday, I talked about Mrs. Rosa Parks being put into this box as though the majority of her work in the movement was with the Montgomery bus boycott. But again, if you have not watched the documentary on Recy Taylor, I highly recommend you watch that. But Black women's bodies have been used in the most disgusting ways since the days of enslavement. Not only have they been used for breeding during the days of enslavement, but the casual sexual violence that has been that Black women faced, especially during the days of the civil rights movement, where even if they were to tell, no white man was going to be convicted, even with all the proof in the world. It adds to a special layer of terror that Black women tend to face. Even to this day, we hear stories of Black women being assaulted as they're serving out their prison sentences. Okay, so we're going to get to the final part of the lecture. So the white woman that we saw speak during Freedom Summer, the wife of Michael Schwerner, Miss Rita Bender, she then formerly Rita Schwerner, she spoke also at the Democratic National Convention. That's her smack in the middle of this photograph, which is right after, I believe, she had spoken at the convention. Okay, so this is the final part. This is probably the most famous part of Mrs. Hamer's speech, and I was able to find video of her giving this last part of the testimony. What I will note is right before this sentence, right after the end of the last sentence that we just heard her say, and right before the first sentence that she says here, she just drops in a line where she says, "I was in jail when Medgar Evers was killed." I remember processing that and wondering why she just kind of seemed to slip that in. It's almost like she remembered casually that she was in jail when Medgar Evers was killed. For me, what that showed, at this point, Fannie Lou Hamer wasn't a well-known name yet in the South. People who were within the activist movement and the movement knew who she was, but general folks did not know who she was, right? So for me, it showed that while she was experiencing this violence in jail, Medgar Evers, who was very much so well known, was also being assassinated. So your status within the movement did not actually protect you. Whether you were a well-known person or you were just an everyday Black person, you were subjected to violence due to you trying to better yourself and better your life, right? They use the term uppity N-word, right? To kind of degrade Black people who are trying to live full lives. Why would you not want your child to have access to good schools? Why would you not want to have stable housing? Why would you not want to have a stable job? It makes no sense. It's as though they don't, whiteness and bigots don't feel like Black people should have full access to citizenship. So Mrs. Hamer kind of drops that line in there, and then she closes out with this. What I want you to pay attention to is her voice. Her voice starts to quiver a little bit and to shake. And I think it's the kind of emotional weight of her understanding what she has endured and also understanding what she may have to continue enduring for the sake of full citizenship in this country. But this is probably one of my most favorite lines of any speech I've ever heard. Oopsies.
All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook, because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Thank you.
And you can hear it, right? And I mean, that is the question, right? Why is it that America does not want to either admit that when the words that said all men were created equal were written, it didn't actually apply to Black people, right? When Thomas Jefferson was writing those words, in the corner was a little Black boy who was the half brother of his wife, I believe, waiting to go, to answer to his every whim. And so this idea that the founding fathers didn't know, I remember Pete Buttigieg saying this, and oh God, that was such a stupid moment, right? That the founding fathers maybe didn't understand how bad things were. It's like, no, you knew. You escaped the UK to Britain to come here to this country so that you can continue this institution and then use the very same language to talk about the tyranny that you just escaped from Great Britain. But she talks about, she challenges what the idea of America is, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Then why does that not apply to Black people? In a very simple way, I question America, right? And she talks about this just little piece of her everyday life where she's talking about having the phones off the hook. And so she finishes off, and the Mississippi Freedom, the Credentials Committee then goes and they have to figure stuff out. And this is kind of how it all ends. And the lady that you're gonna hear talking is Mrs. Annie Devine. What I want you to pay attention with in this last clip is the body language of the white man who's the sergeant at arms. Pay attention to his body language as Mrs. Annie Devine is speaking.
Mr. Sergeant at Arms, have you had any contingency plans for this? None at all. I just stand here peacefully, trying to keep this aisle clear.
Mississippi, when they are before the eyes of the world, they are peaceful and loving. And when they get back to Mississippi, it's nigger, you can't come in here. Nigger, you can't come in there. Nigger, you get out. And here we are in the eyes of the world, seeing the same thing that happens way down in the deep South, Mississippi.
The MFDP was never seated at the 1964 convention, but their protest opened up the Democratic Party and changed national politics. For some, Atlantic City ended in disillusionment. They had lost faith in America's leaders, but they had come to know their own power.
So Mrs. Annie Devine, Mrs. Victoria Gray, and Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer then went on to challenge the seating of 5 Mississippi delegates and became the first Black women to be seated on the floor of the House of Representatives. So it's like, So last slide. This is an image of Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer with her adopted children. Remember, Mrs. Hamer could not have children. And the gentleman is a worker at the Freedom Farm Cooperative. So she went on to found the Freedom Farm Co-op in 1969. And she's quoted in saying that all you had to do to qualify to be part of the co-op is you have to be poor. And that's literally the people that she was trying to save and help. So she got a $10,000 grant and bought 640 acres in Sunflower County. She planted cash crops like soybeans and cotton to pay taxes and admin because only 30 people could actually pay the $30 a month dues to be part of the co-op. The rest of the 1,500 people who were part of it in name only. Still, the rest of the land was planted with cucumbers, peas, beans, even peanuts, squash, collard greens, which were then given back to the community. But her favorite project was the pig bank. After she received a grant from the National Council of Negro Women, she bought 35 female pigs and 5 male pigs, and essentially she would rent them out. So once the pig had piglets, you then would give back the original pig and some of the piglets, and that's how they were able to feed folks during the farm cooperative. It didn't receive federal funding, nor did it receive other government assistance. And so it ended up kind of failing after a few years. But the idea was what some of these urban farms that we have now are based after. Mrs. Hamer died in 1977 at the age of 59 due to complications with hypertension. She had breast cancer and also and diabetes and a host of other illnesses. And Andrew Young, who I believe at the time was the US ambassador to the United Nations, along with others, spoke at her funeral. This was the legacy of Mrs. Hamer, a simple woman with untold brilliance who was able to give a testimony that told a story not only of herself, but also of everyday Mississippians to a national stage, and then went on to become one of the most prolific speakers of the movement. But thank you folks for your time and attention. This is an image of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party giving lectures to young members of SNCC in Hattiesburg. What year? If I remember correctly, I believe that's 1964. To the person who just asked me what year in the chat.
Of that photo, AJ? Of that photo?
Yeah, the last one.
Thanks, AJ, so much. Let's take 30 seconds maybe.
Yeah, thanks. That was a lot. I need a second. All right, Prof.
Okay. AJ, it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a couple things that are just really like educating Northerners, educating white people questions. Okay.
Well, you want to start with the heavy ones. All right.
What do you mean? This is an intellectual question though. What do you mean by vernacular? What is vernacular?
Absolutely. Okay. How do I want to attack this one? Most folks in this space, if you have lived in a community or a city outside of the one that you grew up in, right? Let's say you lived in Seattle your entire life and then you go walk through the Bronx. There's going to be certain words that are used. There's going to be a kind of cadence that is used that you may just not be familiar with. I code switch depending on the environment and the group of people that I'm interacting with. I move between what is considered acceptable English or proper English and what most folks in this space would consider slang, right? Or Ebonics. Ebonics is not slang. AAVE, African American English, vernacular English, is something that is studied by linguists. It's the progression of ways that Black folks communicate due to the inability to have access to schools, right? Also, this idea that proper English is the only way to speak English is tied to white supremacy. You are able to understand me regardless of what I say. My grammatical makeup may be different if I'm speaking in AAVE or in Ebonics, but most of the time you can pretty much still tell what I'm saying. So when you're listening to Mrs. Hamer speak in a public setting like the Democratic National Convention versus when she is speaking to maybe just the everyday sharecropper, her vernacular may switch depending on who she's talking to. Code switching is a very, very natural part of the Black experience when you are interacting with mostly white spaces, because you tend to be judged, your intelligence is judged based on the way that you speak English. Mrs. Hamer may not have spoken quote unquote proper English because, again, remember, she had a 6th grade education, but that does not mean that Mrs. Hamer was not one of the most intelligent people that ever functioned within the movement. So when I'm talking about her vernacular, she doesn't use all these metaphors. And if she does use metaphors, they're deeply tied to the Bible, because the Bible and the church was central to a lot of the lives of Black folks in the South. And so when I'm talking about vernacular, she's not spinning a tale. It's not this kind of mythical journey. She speaks in a way that makes sense to the people and the community that she's a part of, because that is the environment that she grew up in.
Okay, thanks. I could just stay on that question for the next couple hours with you. Let me ask you another question. You and I and many people I respect refer to Fannie Lou Hamer as Mrs.
Correct.
Fannie Lou Hamer. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about why you call her Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer?
Absolutely. One, I'm Black. There's like a thing where you're not supposed to call adults by their first names. If you ever notice, I call Mr. Zellner Dr. Bob. I feel very uncomfortable ever just calling him Bob Zellner. That is just not the way that I was raised. It took me a really long time to call David, which is why most of the time I just call him Prof. Most Black folks, and also just Southern folks in general, you do not have this kind of informal, I will speak for Black people in particular, me and the people that I have in my community, we are not raised to call adults by their first name. Nobody, none of my best friends who I've been best friends with for over 13 years ever will call my mother by her first name. It is Auntie or as Miss Lois or something of that nature. So with Mrs. Hamer, it feels utterly disrespectful to call her Fannie Lou or Fanny. And so that is a cultural thing. A lot of times younger folks refer to their elders in a sense of respect. Most of the easiest way to refer to somebody out of respect is to call them auntie or uncle. Sometimes I will refer to Dr. Bob as Uncle Dr. Bob as well, because that is just the way that I was raised to refer to folks. So with Mrs. Hamer, it's a cultural thing, but most importantly, it's a respect thing, because during her funeral, if you read the transcripts from her funeral, they did not hold her in the reverence that I wish that they had held her to. When Stokely Carmichael, who later changed his name to Kwame Ture, when he was speaking to about her at her funeral, he did talk about her lack of intelligence due to the lack of education. He did talk about how she was a very simple person, but I don't think he was talking about the simplicity in the way that I hoped he was talking about the simplicity. We got to remember, misogyny was a thing, right? Also, there were certain folks in the movement who were trying to present an image of Black folks, that Black folks were middle class, that they deserved to have access to all of the same things that white folks have access to because they live very similar and parallel lives. Mrs. Hamer completely broke that mold. She's a poor sharecropper, didn't receive the education that she should have received. And also there was a point in which Whitney Young was talking to Ed King right before Mrs. Hamer went up to give her testimony and talked about how ugly her dress was. You know, why is she bringing her purse? All of these things. So Mrs. Hamer was not exempt from the critique of some of these civil rights workers who had been in the game and kind of, were a little more middle class than she was. And so one, it's out of respect to Mrs. Hamer. Two, it's because of culture. And three, she deserves to be referred in a way that white women also did not refer to Black women, right? Again, you're talking about Jim Crow. So it's easy if you watch the movie Hidden Figures, right? There's a scene in Hidden Figures where this white woman is talking to this Black woman and calls her by her first name, where this white woman then is supposed to be referred to by her last name as Mrs. So-and-so, right? This is the environment in that space. And I refuse to ever call her by her first name, plain and simple.
Yeah, and the denial to African Americans of those courtesy titles, those respect titles, was one of the very common dimensions of Southern white racism that was intentional. It was built into the system. You didn't get a name. You didn't get a courtesy title, right?
Yeah, that's why referring to somebody as boy or girl, right, is very specific to the civil rights movement. I can understand that I have a slight baby face, but I'm a whole 33 years old. If you refer to me as a girl, we got a problem. The only person who's allowed to refer to me as that is my mother. And I know when she refers to me as that, I'm getting in trouble. Okay. So this idea of, whiteness always having this kind of overarching control over how a Black person can even present themselves is one of those kind of insidious small pieces of the civil rights movement and Jim Crow that we don't always talk about. And that part isn't taught or explored in school the way that I think it could be.
Okay, thanks, AJ. And folks, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat, please. Drop them into the chat and I'll go ahead and ask AJ. I want to ask you a question about Mrs. Hamer. There's so much about her that is inspiring. You and I both consider her an incredible American hero or shiro, right? Can you tell us one dimension, just pick one, about not as it's not the only one, is not the premier one, but just one that makes you think about her in this profound, transformative way about her?
I feel like I should have gotten that question ahead of time. The quickest answer that I can come up with is we've all heard the ideology of like, you need to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right? The other side of that is we don't always talk about people not having boots to pick themselves up by, right? In order for you to do that, you got to have boots on your feet to pick yourself up, right? Mrs. Hamer was not given boots and she figured out a way anyway. Mrs. Hamer understood that the Constitution told her that she had the right to vote and she was going to go with it. That's all she needed. All she needed to know was the Constitution gave her the right to do this thing, and she was going to exercise her right come hell or high water. That single-minded determination is something that I admire, not only from Mrs. Hamer, but just the Black women in my life in general, the Black women that I have studied, the Black women who don't get the credit that they deserve for the work that they've done in this movement, both back then and also now. So for me, Mrs. Hamer represents that even when you have absolutely nothing, you can, if you are able to figure out a way through it. And so that is a motivating factor for me, that even in my darkest days, and it's not one of those like, oh, Mrs. Hamer survived this, so I could survive that. I don't like comparing pain, right? The Pain Olympics is not something that we need to get into. What she does is she urges me, the same thing that she did for folks in the movement, right? With her singing, she urged you to keep going, right? You may need to take a break, you may need to take a pause, but as long as you don't move backwards, you can do it. Mrs. Hamer said that she was what, 5 feet, and she would say 5'4", right? And she would say that if I fall, at least I'm going to fall forward 5 feet and 4 inches. So for me, there's nothing about Mrs. Hamer that tells me I can't. Everything about Mrs. Hamer tells me that I can. And so that is why she is my one of my most favorite historical figures ever.
When you read the speech, when you read the speech, and then you listen to it and you watch it, and that's what it's you read it, the words, and then you view portions of it at least, and then you listen to it. Was there a particular thing in there that struck you and surprised you, or that like caught you differently, like you read it one way, but when you heard it from her, you heard it differently, or when you saw it, or you made the point about she never looks down. Okay, she never looks down. I've never heard anybody say something like, give me that fact, okay? And so that's like, AJ, that's the kind of stuff you publish in a journal, okay? Like that factoid, because it spoke to something, it meant something. So was there anything in the text, either in the reading, the listening, or the hearing, that just like, whoa, that really made you stop and you're like, I gotta just sit with this for a little while?
Yeah, for me, it was the line that she said about her being in jail when Medgar Evers was killed. I didn't understand the gravity of that line until I heard the speech, because when you read it, it reads as though it's just part of the flow of the conversation. When you listen to it, she literally just kind of slips it in there almost as an aside. Like I said, it's almost like she just remembered, oh, I happened to be in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. Those two things are extremely traumatic points, both in the movement and to her, right? This thing is happening where Medgar Evers is murdered. She's also being beaten within an inch of her life. But for her, it's just like something that's so casual to remember. Violence is such an everyday part of the struggle for Black folks during the height of the civil rights movement that you can just say something like that and she doesn't pause. She literally just kind of talks right through that sentence before she gets to the end of it. And so for me, that was really the piece. And also that last section where she says, I question America. Is this the land of the free, the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook on the account of our lives being threatened daily, right? That when you hear her say it, right, you start to hear the quiver in her voice, you start to hear the emotion, right? You start to really understand how deep her pain is. And this is just within 2 years, right? This is 1964. She literally had registered to vote for the first time in 1962. So imagine all the violence that she's not telling us about that she faced. So for me, reading it and then seeing that line and then hearing that line and the way that line is delivered is the part that got me to be like, okay, wait, because she's literally asking, she goes into questioning America. If these two things are happening simultaneously to people in Mississippi, then what is America? This also like reminds me of John Lewis saying, I question what side the federal government is on, right? In all these different points, right? The country is supposed to be providing an environment, a space based on the Constitution, based on the founding documents of this country, based on the Reconstruction Amendments, right? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment essentially guarantee life, right to a free and happy life for Black people in this country. And yet the country is like, no, we're going to figure out ways around this. And so she's questioning America, but her voice in that moment, and then having to see the video and realizing that she's saying all of this, her voice is shaking, but her body and body language is steady. And I think the reason I picked up on that is as a Black person in a very white city, I have to be consistently aware of the body language of white folks, because if a white person feels as though they're in danger, that's now my life in danger. So when I'm in PCC or I'm walking around the neighborhood or whatever, I have to be X amount of distance away from a white person, because when they start to feel that anxiety, then that's me putting myself at risk. So body language is something that you are unintentionally trained to pick up on when you are a person of color. And so maybe that's why I was able to pick up on the fact that she never put her head down, because I know that also as a sign of respect, Black people during the days of Jim Crow were not supposed to even look at white people in the eye. So imagine Mrs. Hamer sitting during Jim Crow and staring at all these white men and women in their eyes, in their faces, giving this testimony, this account of what constituents, Black constituents in the state, in the county of Stennis and Eastland are doing, just the sheer bravery of that. And she gives her address. So she's like, come find me at this point, non-violently, hopefully, but she's also like, come find me. There's nothing about Mrs. Hamer that I can find fault in.
Okay. Thank you, AJ. I want to ask two final questions because they came through the chat. Okay. And then we'll close it up. And I know that this talk and this content and all of this history, this reality is exhausting and it's traumatic. And thank you, AJ, for taking us through it. Could you describe the relationship as you understand it, as you have observed it, between Bob Moses, Mr. Bob Moses, and Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer? And I loved that photo you showed of them at the convention. Because I'm like, Moses has got a tie on. It was amazing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Bob Moses was definitely known for some of his more casual attire. But the way I'm starting to look, actually, Tom, thank you for your question, because I'm starting to look into the relationship that different civil rights workers had with each other. There was so much overlap between, especially due to COFO, between multiple different organizations. Like Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner represented SNCC, and they represented CORE, right? The three of them. But the way that I understood is Bob Moses definitely had a reverence for Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and also for Mrs. Ella Baker. And so it was just a pure respect. Bob Moses was also known for sitting in the back of the room and listening to everybody talk, and he would take notes. And then once he kind of had listened to everybody, took his notes, then he would go and he would speak. Bob Moses also had a very quiet voice. I think it was that of like an aunt and a nephew between Bob Moses and Mrs. Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was also known for kind of sitting out on her porch and she's snapping peas and she's holding court, right? She would give lessons. Mrs. Hamer was brilliantly proficient in the Bible. So she would use the Bible to kind of tell these tales of how we needed to keep going, how we needed to push the fight. And Bob Moses was known for going and sitting and listening to her talk. Also, he understood that she knew the people in the community of Sunflower County better than anybody else. And so he was down to have conversations with her about how to go about getting the community involved in certain parts of activism. And then he would just take her advice, because why wouldn't he? She had grown up in this community. She knew the people better than anybody else. And it was a very collaborative effort. He absolutely respected her opinion. So far as of what I have read. Now, You ask me this question 2 months from now, I don't know what I will have discovered, okay? But as of now, what I know is Mr. Moses had a very respectful relationship with Mrs. Hamer. It'd be similar to a mentor and mentee. You know, she learned from him too, because Mr. Moses had an understanding of what was necessary in the planning and logistical space for voter reg. Mr. Moses was one of the folks in SNCC who wanted to move towards voter registration as opposed to direct action. In that October 1961 conversation where Mrs. Ellen Baker was like, you understand that like voter registration is actually direct action. And so, yeah, he definitely, they had a pretty brilliant relationship. But also, again, I'm still digging into that. I will like ask me in like 2 months and my answer might change.
And the other question is from Winona Hollins Haig, but I'm going to truncate it because that we don't have, she asked a life journey question. So what makes you what has gotten you, what's an important attribute that has gotten you to this point where you can make this presentation to us and you can talk to us about these histories, about these realities, and you can weave it with the current contemporary dimensions, your own lived experiences. What's an important attribute in your life that is like a discipline or a practice that helps you to be this?
That is an excellent question. To be honest, curiosity is really what it is. I was raised in an environment where, I mean, we all know, first and foremost, kids are annoying. Let's just be real, right? Kids are cute, they're great. Also, kids are annoying because they ask a bunch of questions. The thing that my mom did is rather than telling me, oh, you're being annoying, stop asking me questions, is my mom would say, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Why don't you go find out and then come back and teach both of us? So one, she got to keep me busy. And two, she nurtured this natural curiosity that I have. I like learning about everything. I mean, I watch Planet Earth religiously. I know how to use an impact drill. I can paint a room in a matter of hours. I should be working at IKEA because I'm very good with my hands. Anything that kind of sates this curious nature that I have, I want to learn about it. So that's probably the reason why I was able, literally in a matter of, I started kind of my history journey in 2017, where I think, David, you asked me this question on Monday, like 5 years ago, what percentage of this stuff do I know? And I think I said like 5 or 3%. And that's true. I just read a lot. Also, to be fair, I don't have responsibilities outside of myself. I don't have children. So I'm sure if I had children, it'd probably be different because I wouldn't have as much time to read. But I literally just like spend all day reading. I mean, there's 3 books on my counter right now, in addition to like articles. And so all I do is just, I follow the rabbit hole. It's like Alice in Wonderland. I just keep going down the rabbit hole. I click the links of the links and just keep going. But to be honest, it's just natural curiosity. Also, in order for me to understand why I am able to have the privileges that I have now, it's important for me to know where those privileges came from, okay? We all are given a certain narrative about history. We're given a certain kind of cookie cutter idea of what happened. Rosa Parks didn't sit down. Martin Luther King had a dream. Malcolm X was a bad guy. But we now are knowledgeable enough to know that those narratives that we were taught in school aren't always the complete picture or just aren't the picture at all. And so I decided I wanted to figure out how and what actually happened during these periods of time. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Uncle Bob in 2017. He's been a really kind of constant person in my life. And rather than having him be the one to tell me the story, because at the end of the day, we need our civil rights activists to rest. Dr. Bob has literally given his entire life to the movement, and I want him to rest. In order for Dr. Bob to rest, in order for Diane Nash, all these folks who've been in the movement to rest, somebody has to pick up that mantle. I have full access to get all of the histories and experiences that Dr. Bob has lived through without traumatizing him all over again, unless he's ready to tell that story. And so for me, it's imperative that if I'm going to be the next generation that takes up the mantle from folks like Dr. Bob or Dr. Lafayette, or even John Lewis and C.T. Vivian before they passed, I have to have a wealth of information so that we are not consistently reinventing the wheel or consistently re-traumatizing the folks who got us to this point. I am working towards allowing and creating space for folks like Dr. Bob to rest. And so that is my motivating factor. That plus natural curiosity is really the thing that drives me. And I'm lucky enough to work in an organization like CP that allows me the space to do all of that. And also, that does not mean that I should be the only person doing it. We all have access to this information, right? Everybody, again, Adrian Shropshire says there are multiple ways to get to the North Star. My way just happens to be through education. I urge you all to figure out what ways that you can participate in this, whether it's through CP and, you know, going out and doing field work or writing letters or making phone calls, or it's through these simple conversations that you can have with people in your life who are showing racist tendencies, right? It doesn't always have to be you joining a protest or starting a nonprofit or anything like that. It can literally be these small moments in which you redirect somebody's conversation or the language that you're using into more positive language or into less racist language. Then we don't have young children growing up in environments where they think it's okay to, you know, have really like crappy behavior. There's always a ripple effect in everything that you do. There's nothing that ever only happens to you. It either affects you or it affects your immediate family or it affects your community. At the end of the day, I have nieces and nephews. And during this crazy ass political time, they're going to ask me like, what were you doing during this time? And I'm like, I was sitting in front of Zoom room trying to tell people about Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, right? I was trying to give Dr. Bob a break from having to explain all of the stuff that he had gone through. I'm just trying to do my part. And so that's what I urge people to do. I urge you all to figure out something that is sustainable for you and then to dive in with the same curiosity that you had about trying to figure out how to get to space when you were little, or how to become a doctor, an astronaut, or a deep sea diver. That is the same curiosity that I attack history with. What is the thing that I'm going to learn today? What is some small fact of some story that I've heard a million times that is going to shift the way that I learn or even the way that I teach this story? That's literally it. It's not complicated. It's not rocket science. It's just pure and natural curiosity that was nurtured by my mom, and then now nurtured by folks like David and Charles and Dr. Bob, who don't, and especially Dr. Scott. Y'all don't understand how many times I have bothered that lady or I've been like, can you explain to me this really obscure fact from 1963? She'll be like, hold on. And she'll send me an article. She'll be like, go explore. So that's really all it is. I mean, this sounds like it's really simple, but I mean, it is. It's not. It's a lot of time, but also it is really simple.
Yeah, it's an enormous amount of work.
I
think that was a mic drop right there, AJ. Thank you. Let's give her AJ a round of applause and appreciation, and we're gonna say good night to everybody. Okay, AJ?
Absolutely. Thanks, folks. I really appreciate it. Y'all go take some time to decompress. I say this at the end of every lecture. This information is heavy. It's difficult for some folks to process, so find some time to take care of yourself. We are going on a mini education hiatus because David and I have to go to Virginia to travel, but CP will be back with more education programs. And again, thank you all for your support and the kind words. Really appreciate it. We'll just send out a list of resources to everybody who signed up so folks can kind of poke through stuff that they find interesting. And as always, thank you so much for your time and your support. Prof, it's always fun doing these things with you. Thank you for being the first person really to actually introduce me into the world of civil rights history. So a lot of this is thanks to kind of you nurturing that space for me. Appreciate it.
It's a gift. You've been the gift to us, AJ. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. Good night. Good night. Thanks, AJ. I'm gonna literally close it now. I'm going to.
Yeah, go ahead. Bye.